Hey, Jeff. Hey, Will.
Hey, Tim.
What's up, Tim?
For the podcast today, we watched the nuclear submarine movie Crimson Tide. You know, I always wanted to watch a movie where Crimson Tide's USS Alabama went toe-to-toe with the Red October to see who would win. You know what? I bet the disappointing answer would be is that it would be a draw because both captains would be dealing with mutinies and probably feuding about how many pings to send each other.
Tim,
Yeah, but you're being
thanks
super.
for being super critical, man.
Welcome to another episode of the Supercritical Podcast, where we delve into the fun and oftentimes nonsensical way pop culture portrays nuclear weapons. My name is Tim Westmyer, someone who studies nuclear weapons and works on nuclear nonproliferation for a living. And I am excited to be joined today in the virtual podcast studio by not one, but two awesome returning guests. First up, Geoff Wilson, Political Director at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation at Nuclear Wilson on Twitter. You'll remember Jeff from our previous episodes, things like Starship Troopers, Chernobyl, and I think all of the Godzilla movies. Jeff, welcome back.
One ping only, baby. Just one ping only, please.
All right. We are also here, because they usually are found in pairs. We are welcoming back Will Saetren at Will Saetren on Twitter, Policy Advisor for the Norwegian Ministry of Defense. Will's been on so many episodes that it's not worth recounting them all here on the podcast. He's been fun on here. But most recently, we were discussing the movie Heroes of Telmark. Welcome back, Will.
Stoked to be here, Tim.
So it's great to assemble this team back together again because we're going to hear to talk about a nuclear weapons delivery system that seems to be back in the news headlines recently, nuclear submarines. We're going to talk about the 1995 movie Crimson Tide. And as the movie poster tells us, this movie is about, quote, the nuclear submarine USS Alabama, where one man has absolute power, and one man will do anything to stop him. A young first officer, Denzel Washington, stages a mutiny to prevent his trigger-happy Captain Gene Hackman from launching his nuclear missiles before confirming the orders to do so. Pretty crazy situation, but, this movie is fun. But let's first get into why nuke submarines are back in the headlines. Jeff, why are we talking about this from the newspaper standpoint?
This is something that has flummoxed a lot of people recently, is the difference between nuclear submarines, right? Is it nuclear-powered submarines or nuclear-armed submarines?
They're not the same?
They're not the same, but the United States has just entered into a contract that we stole from our good buddies France to build Australia a new series of nuclear-powered submarines to help safeguard the Pacific against the Chinese. And this made a huge kerfuffle recently. However, I will say those submarines are different than these ones are. These are nuclear-armed submarines. Those are nuclear-powered submarines. So it's talking about couple of different things.
Yeah, well, the French, I think, aren't upset that they would potentially give nuclear weapons to the Australians. It's more like they lost out on $66 billion worth of contracts. So I think everybody's upset here. The French, the Chinese, I think everyone's upset except for U.S. defense contractors who get to now bid on that. But I think actually more importantly, we're here to talk about nuclear submarines because Jeff recently moved away from the D.C. area and now lives on the West Coast in the state of Washington, which is home to one of the two U.S. naval bases where our nuclear missile launching submarines are stationed out there. So this was directed by the late Tony Scott, who directed movies like Top Gun, Days of Thunder, one of my favorites, Beverly Hills Cop 2. And he also collaborated with Denzel and a couple other movies like Man on Fire, which is excellent, and Unstoppable. Hans Zimmer helped with the score, and funny enough, Quentin Tarantino came in to help punch up some of the dialogue, which is kind of interesting.
This is clearly when Tony Scott was going through his Navy phase. However.
Oh yeah. Well, apparently, we'll get into this, but Top Gun movie, obviously, the Navy loved it. Made everybody, including me as a kid, wanting to join and fly some Tomcats. But this movie, a lot less so because of the content of the movie. They didn't help him out so much. But Will, who's in this film?
Oh, man. All the people. So obviously Gene Hackman, Denzel Washington, Viggo Mortensen is in it. Everybody's favorite Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. James Gandolfini was in it. Tony Soprano. I was like, did not remember that one. And there were a couple other familiar faces that had pretty substantial roles there as well. And that is another thing that I really liked about this movie. You know, we were talking before the podcast about comparison between this and Hunt for Red October and other movies. Like, even like there were very few actors that had, like, you know, one line roles. They were all pretty substantive, and I feel like everybody worked together to pull this movie together.
This is the first time I'd seen this movie since I was a child, essentially. But I have a series of notes that are just at Vigo ? Exclamation point. James Gandolfini ! Exclamation point. And then Steve Zahn. Like, you know, like it was just like more and more people. I was like, everyone's in there.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And a lot of people too that have played in former nuke movies. Denzel Washington's in a film called Eli, which takes place in a post-apocalypse situation. Gene Hackman, as Will knows, sorry about that, is in Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, because Will was a guest on that episode. Yeah, Evan Vigo in the great story The Road, which is a Cormac McCarthy book. Not really a nuke movie, but people associate it with it, given the kind of the landscape. That's a book I read every year. I don't know why. I don't know if James Gandolfini's been in any nuke movies that I've figured out, but there is a cameo at the end by Jason Robards, plays a couple of nuke movies, like The Day After. It's one of his kind of main roles that he's known for, as well as A Boy and His Dog. Yeah, so a lot of great people in this movie, a lot of nuke experience behind it, and it did pretty well in the box office too. According to Box Office Mojo, made $174 million on about a $53 million budget, and Rotten Tomatoes critics like it, 88% rating. So as we dive into this, I think there are two questions that we can think about as we go through. One, how accurate is the launch protocol situation that they just portray in the movie, you know, when it comes to nuclear missile submarines? And it's a little different than it is with nuclear silos or a heavy bomber. It's a little bit different, kind of starts the same, but then ends differently. So I think it's worth getting into how close they get it, because it's a key plot point. And also, you know, a pretty important thing when we think about nuclear deterrence and how easy it is or hard it is to get into a nuclear war. And finally, kind of what role do nuclear missile launching submarines, these SSBNs, what do they play the role in warfighting and deterrence strategies? Because again, a different way of handling this as part of the triad of missiles, submarines, and bombers. So before we, again, dive in to this nuclear submarine movie, as usual, spoiler warning. If you haven't seen this movie, it's currently on Amazon Prime streaming, so you have no excuse. Unless you're not an Amazon person, which is also a pretty good excuse.
Or if you live abroad.
Oh, yeah.
I went to Amazon Prime, which I have my account here abroad, but it detected that I was abroad, even though I had a VPN on, and I had to rent it. It was not included in my Prime subscription.
Well, I'll Venmo you that. Appreciate it, dude.
As you no doubt heard, my exo has appendicitis. Your name was at the top of the list.
That's good to know, sir.
It was a short list.
There's trouble in Russia. So they called us. And we're going over there and bringing the most lethal killing machine ever devised.
The last time we hit this state of emergency was 32 and a half years ago during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this is what it's all about, gentlemen. It's what we train for.
Submerge the ship.
Diving officer, submerge the ship, make it depth 150 feet.
On the 1MC. Dive, dive.
This year,
We have a properly formatted emergency action message from National Command Authority.
what we've always known
Bravo, Echo, Echo, Charlie, Alpha.
becomes what we've always feared.
Gentlemen, this is the captain. Russian rebels have threatened to launch against our country and are fueling right now. This is not a drill.
Now,
Sir, we have a possibly submerged submarine.
You find out who that is.
Receiving emergency action message. Recommend alert 1.
the battle for survival begins.
That's a message fragment.
Sir, we don't know what this message means. Our target package could have changed.
I've made a decision.
There's no place for fear.
He's lost his nerve.
I'd rather go out myself and get this one wrong.
There's no room for mistakes.
If we launch and we're wrong, what's left of Russia is going to launch at us.
I'm captain of this boat. I don't have to think this over.
There's no time for doubt.
Missile system's ready to launch in 6 minutes.
You repeat this order or I'll find somebody who will.
Hell no, you won't, sir.
And nothing can stop the tide.
Right forward.
1,000 yards of closing dive. Make your depth 1,200 feet.
me! They're fueling our missiles!
He's right on top of us!
Place commando, under arrest, under charge of mutiny! Roger, ready?
Lock Captain Ramsey in his stateroom.
Fire one, now! Give me the missile key, Mr. Hunter.
Sir, we are going down!
I'm the commander of this ship!
Crimson Tide.
God help you if you're wrong.
If I'm wrong, then we're at war. God help us all.
All right, so we get some opening text here. The three most powerful men in the world, the movie tells us at the beginning. The President of the United States, the President of the Russian Republic, and the Captain of a U.S. nuclear missile submarine. Really starts us off pretty strong here. How do you guys feel about that statement?
I think it's spot on. I think that what's important for people to understand right at the outset here is exactly what we're talking about. Each of these Ohio ballistic missile submarines have 20 launch tubes. So they have 20 missile silos in them, essentially. Each one of these missiles is MIRVed, meaning that it's fitted with multiple warheads, and they can carry up to 8 warheads. I've talked to Hans Christensen about this before, and they typically carry 4 to 5.
Mm.
And principally what we're talking about here is 2 different warheads. One is 100 kilotons and one is 455 kilotons. So that's one boat, 20 missiles, 5 warheads. Each boat is carrying about 100 nuclear weapons. And I think that it rounds out to something like a couple thousand Hiroshimas, depending upon what the actual armament is. I mean, this is a significant amount of nuclear devastation in one submarine.
I think they have the majority, especially these days, of the warheads that are deployed actively are on submarines. They're more than the missiles and the bombers, I believe, put together.
Yeah, I think it's something like 900 warheads are deployed on them or something like that.
Yeah, and you mentioned how they only have about 4 to 5 actually per missile per tube. I think that's because of treaty limits. But they could, if we got out of the treaty, we could have, I think, like 8, 10, 14, depends on, I think, the warhead size.
Yeah, so the D5 can hold up to 10 individual warheads. And the other part of it is weight, right? Mm-hmm. Is where is the target? How much weight is on top of the missile for its ballistic trajectory? But yeah, like you said, a lot of it has to do, because we count each warhead on these things and launchers for New START. So it's all about what is the treaty compliance for the amount that they can carry, but they can carry a lot.
Yeah. Well, speaking of weight, our characters and the world is got a heavy burden on it in the movie. I think this is a kind of a mid-1990s film. It's post-Soviet Union collapsing. It's Russia that's not openly hostile at the top leadership level to the United States, but it's still kind of trying to find its footing. We get a briefing from CNN. It's aboard a French aircraft carrier. I thought, for some reason, I was like, wow, French aircraft carrier story, nukes, submarines, French upset at U.S. submarine. I was like, this is a weird serendipity. We getting some reports that Russia is having some internal conflicts, almost to the point of a civil war. We have Russia striking against some groups in Chechnya that causes a big violent uprising in Russia, and there's this ultra-nationalist, radical Russian leader, Vladimir Radchenko, who kind of comes out of nowhere, seizes control over a nuclear missile base in Russia, which they say is near the North Korean and Chinese border. They call it Artyom, which I don't think is a real place. I tried looking for it. It is the name of a character in the Metro 2033 video game series and book series. I don't know if that's what it's drawing on, but that's certainly what I think of when I think of Artyom. But anyways, now this individual has access to 25 nuclear, armed missiles, which each of those has about 10 warheads apiece. And he also has got a bunch of attack submarines, like 4 of these Akula class attack submarines that are quiet, maybe nuclear powered, but they're not nuclear missile, launching submarines. He gets these missiles, he gets these submarines, and he says, leave me alone. The Russian government and the U.S., don't bother me. I'm here to take over this country. Will, what do you think of this situation? Is this a good situation to be in?
Oh, it's a terrible situation to be in. And it's very, like, this part of the movie, and really, like, I think the entire movie, it's inspired by real events. This is, early Russian Federation after the collapse of the Soviet Union. in real life, in 1993, there was a precursor. We almost thought we had a civil war on our hands in Russia. So basically, Boris Yeltsin, who was the Russian president at the time, tried to dissolve parliament. He did not have the constitutional power to do so. He argued that there had been a referendum that gave him the power to do so. Parliament said no. There was a standoff, and Yeltsin resolved that standoff by sending in the army. They sent in tanks and they shelled the Russian White House, which is like their parliament building. So imagine Donald Trump sending tanks to shell Congress because they're counting up votes fraudulently for the election, right? Like, doesn't seem so far-fetched anymore. But like, basically, that's what happened in Russia in 1993. And people were seriously concerned that there was gonna be a civil war. So I think that part, some of the footage that they used here in this fictive CNN segment on the French aircraft carrier is from that. Some of the actual footage from that siege that happened. So that was particularly striking to me. Also, at the time, Russia had some far-right politicians who were gaining serious traction. A guy named Gennady Zyuganov, who is still in the Russian Duma today, by the way.
Wow.
He was the representative of the Communist Party, was very anti-American, very outspoken. And in 1996, so the way that the Russian electoral system works is if no presidential candidate gets 50% of the vote, it goes to a second round of voting. So neither he nor Boris Yeltsin got that or any of the other candidates. So it was the second round. People thought he was going to win the second round of voting, and Yeltsin pulled out all the stops, got some very suspicious help from oligarchs and in part the United States as well, and ended up winning the election. I think that politician was the inspiration for Radchik.
And that actor that plays that politician is great. He's the same guy who, if you ever watched the movie Super Troopers, he plays the bad guy cop. And I think he's also, what else is he in? He also plays Mr. Kruger, who is George Costanza's, one of George Costanza's many bosses on Seinfeld. Great actor, and plays a pretty good Russian villain in this one.
I think it's sort of interesting, just to add on to what Will's saying here, is that this idea of sort of nuclear secession, it's really happened, right? Like after the breakup of the Soviet Union, like Ukraine is left with a bunch of nuclear weapons that need to be repatriated back to Russia. Like this isn't entirely a fictional event. Countries have fallen and their nuclear weapons have been sort of left out, you know. There's a question about sort of in rebellions or uprisings, could nuclear weapons be loose? And since we're talking about the state of Washington here anyways, where the Pacific Boomer fleet is, I always think it's interesting to say, should the state of Washington decide to secede from the Union tomorrow, it would be the third largest nuclear power in the world, right? Like these things, they have happened. It is possible. And especially given sort of fractive political environments today, it's something that people should continue to think about.
And the movie tells us, for at least now, we're okay, because the Russian leaders, they believe that Vladimir and his group, which I'll call the dissidents kind of throughout this movie discussion, but like they say that the dissidents do not have access to the, quote, nuclear codes, the launch codes, or I guess the Shaget, which is the Russian version of the nuclear football.
Just let us begin the facts. We've been informed by the NSA that an entire rebel corps of the Russian army is involved. There seems to be massive defections. Vladimir appears to be winning the hearts and minds of the Russian soldiers.
They've seized the region by the Chinese and North Korea borders. That includes a submarine base, from which they've surged 4 Akula-class attack subs. They've acquired a nuclear base at Artum that houses 25 hardened silos for Russian ICBMs, armed with up to 10 warheads apiece. Now, the Russian government has assured us that talks are underway. They claim that Ryzhenko forces do not possess the launch codes.
But if Ryzhenko were to crack them, they could launch against our West Coast direct, or come in over the pole, take out Washington and New York.
The Commander-in-Chief has directed U.S. military forces to set DEFCON 4.
We've been ordered to get underway at 0600 hours to assume alert coverage, mid-Pacific, the Far Eastern TVD target package.
But they say that they're going to crack the codes. They can figure it out. I'm not sure how they do that or what that means, but it's movie talk for there's a timeline, they're going to get access to the codes, and then they say very explicitly in the movie, once they get that, they're going to be able to fire at either Washington, D.C. or New York. Or any country or any place in the world, because these things can go anywhere. But anyways, they definitely can hit D.C. in New York. pretty scary situation here. What's the U.S. do in response? Well, it deploys some troops, it deploys some submarines, it deploys assets kind of into the region. And there's multiple points in the movie where they reference, this is the most troops, the most severe situation, all of this stuff since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And remember that because we'll talk later in the nuclear discussion about why there was a situation with the nuclear submarine in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we'll actually be able to kind of draw on that. And the movie does as well to kind of describe, what's happening here. With these new forces deployed into the region, they've got a mission, which we'll talk about in just a second here, but first they need a crew. They got to pull a crew together. So Lieutenant Commander Hunter, who plays by Denzel Washington, and Lieutenant Peter Insee, played by Viggo Mortensen, they're called into action. They're at a birthday party, but they get a phone call while watching all the crazy stuff on the news, and they're asked to bring their skills to a new submarine, the USS Alabama, which is commanded by Captain Frank Ramsey, played by Gene Hackman. It seems like they're all kind of new to each other a little bit. I mean, Viggo knows Denzel. Viggo also, I think, at one point worked for Gene Hackman on a sub, so that someone they know each other, but it's for Denzel and Gene Hackman, it's kind of a new relationship. So he first has to pass a job test, basically like an interview, and he does because he laughs at Captain Ramsey's really inappropriate 2021 inappropriate dirty jokes about horses and women. But I think more importantly, the captain's Jack Russell Terrier, who's allowed on the submarine, by the way, likes him. So I think that's kind of a key test.
The most important character in the whole film is Jack Russell Terrier, though. I'm 100% serious. And it has foreshadowing because the dog gets up on his lap and he's like, he likes you. They're the smartest animals in the world. That means that you're a good egg or something, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
I like it. The dog should have later on tested the authenticity of the messages.
Yes, that would be awesome.
I have a note later on that says, dogs can sense evil with exclamation points. So,
well, Ramsey gets to have this dog on the submarine because he's one of the few captains, they say, that's in that Navy that's actually seen combat tours in places like Panama and elsewhere. Ramsey, he gets to do what he wants, and his opinion matters. And his opinion is that this, Vladimir guy is the real deal, that he thinks that if we don't, go there and to the region and kind of show our force, and if he thinks we're pushovers, if we don't do, all that stuff, then he's willing to launch these weapons once he gets the codes. So the U.S. goes under DEFCON 5. The mission for the USS Alabama, get to the region. If Vladimir, and this is the key thing here they keep talking about, if he fuels the missiles, if he gets the codes and he fuels his missiles, then the U.S. will preemptively launch nuclear weapons out of the USS Alabama in the region and destroy those silos. They obviously don't want to do it now because that would piss off the Russians and a bunch of other people. They don't want to preemptively use these nuclear weapons. But once this looks like it's a situation where they need to do this, then they're going to go ahead and do it. So Ramsey makes this big speech about why nuclear submarines are the frontline defense of the United States, and he demands absolute deference to him once you step foot on his boat. The big fun scene after the end of all this speech, they decide to chant, "Go Bama, roll tide."
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide. I heard everybody basically cheers this except for one guy I think I saw in the background who quietly whispered War Eagle from somewhere else in Alabama.
There's trouble in Russia. So they called us. And we're going over there and bringing the most lethal killing machine ever devised. We constitute the front line and the last line of defense. I expect and demand your very best. Anything less, you should have joined the Air Force. This might be our Commander-in-Chief's Navy, but this is my boat. And all I ask is that you keep up with me. And what do we say? Go down! Roll tide!
Pretty funny. I just want to interject here though. Like it's interesting. Like the major premises of the movie is that like they are sending this SSBN to the region as a show of strength, right? Like deterrence to deter the adversary. That is absolutely not what you do in real life. Like you send an aircraft carrier, you're sending a conventional message of strength. Or if you're sending a nuclear message of strength, you send B-52 bombers, like you deploy B-52 bombers to the region. Yeah. SSBNs, the whole point is that they're under, they're far below the surface and they're stealthy. They're invisible.
And they're already out there, right? Like they're
exactly.
already
They're already out there. They're invisible.
Yeah. Nobody goes like, "Hey, we got a crisis. Go send another sub out." Like,
yeah.
Who had the bright idea in this movie to like put a patrol of a nuclear missile launching submarine near Russia? Who would have thought that would be something that you'd ever want to do? Yeah. It's very silly. There's a couple things that are like that. If you knew about the plot because of your nuclear knowledge and you combine those together, you're like, wait, that doesn't make any sense. That's definitely one of them.
Take a step back real quick. I think that actually the most interesting and important part of this film is sort of a throwaway line that you briefly hinted at right there. Like, where he says the Navy puts up with Gene Hackman's eccentricities because he's like the last subboat captain to have like combat experience or something. This like absolutely is true. This reminds me of Hyman Rickover like crazy. Like
he's quoted all over this movie. Yeah, they mentioned him a couple times.
Yeah, like Hyman Rickover, like the father of the nuclear navy, had like this stranglehold on who became subboat captains in nuclear submarines in the U.S. Navy. The Navy ended up hating him, like did not want him to be the admiral in charge of the like silent service anymore. And they tried to like say, listen, you're too old, like you're getting up in your 60s now, it's past your mandatory retirement date. Rickover got a commutation of his sentence basically from Congress every year saying that he needed to continue to be the admiral in charge of subs. Some commanders are eccentric thing in the Navy is 100% accurate. Rickover used to ask the Rickover question to every person that was going to be involved in potentially being a captain in the nuclear Navy. And he'd walk in and he did things like saw off the fronts of the chairs so that they would feel uncomfortable already, or like he'd have all candidates wait in a broom closet or something for an hour before meeting with him. And then he would be like, I want you to prove to me the existence of Santa Claus. And that was it. And you had to think on your feet for like 2 minutes or whatever to come up with a way to prove the existence to Santa Claus with him. And whether or not you could do it was what made you a captain in the nuclear Navy or not.
I like that interview much more than trying to laugh at dirty jokes about horses. I think that's a much better technique. So let's talk really briefly here about submarines and submarines that launch nuclear weapons, because I want to talk briefly about what they are and kind of what they can do and where they're located, and then Will and Geoff can kind of jump in about kind of what role they serve in the nuclear deterrence. 'Cause it's important to know this. I think people who listen to our podcast, like we can talk about the point by point beats of the plot, but like they listen to this kind of stuff because that's what they want to know. These days, we have, as Geoff talked about earlier, what's called the Ohio class SSBN, nuclear missile launching submarines. We have 14 of them and about 52 or so nuclear powered attack submarines. And these are the ones that, not the exact kind, but the kind that the United States is going to be working on selling to Australia. And these are the ones that are nuclear powered in terms of the reactor, and they run really quiet because they're not as loud as a diesel powered propulsion system. But we've got 14 of these missile launching ones, and usually 2 or any given point are like dry docked with repair and retrofits. They do this about once or twice in the life cycle, and these life cycles for these submarines are really long. They're decades long. And then about 8 to 10 or so are deployed these days on what are called deterrence patrols, where they go quiet, they're by themselves more or less most of the time, they run deep, they get their messages every once in a while, but they don't surface until they're more or less done with their deterrence patrol. And these patrols can last quite a long time. They're either on the east coast or the west coast of the U.S. They're either at, like I mentioned, near Bangor, Washington at Naval Base Kitsap, or they're at Kings Bay, Georgia, at kind of the 2 different locations. You can imagine why on either coast. Well, the U.S. is benefiting by the fact that it has 2 different oceans on either side, and those are different places where you'd want to have nuclear weapon launching submarines. Each of these Ohio-class subs has around 24 tubes for missiles for Trident II, but in each one, as Geoff mentioned earlier, usually can carry around 8 of those warheads per missile, but most of the time they're around 4 due to treaty limits. And we're in an interesting period with the history of the nuclear missile submarines because we're in the middle of a very, very expensive, long process of replacing all of these for the new generation of Columbia-class nuclear submarines. There's going to be about 12 of these planned, with the first coming online sometime in 2028. Very long lead time when you make a decision about a nuclear submarine in order how long it takes to plan it, design it, build it, and actually get it ready to go. And once they're in service, the planned life is about 42 years of service. So these are decisions that they make, and they're going to be decades from now before they're offline. And these, interesting enough, will be not have as many tubes for missiles. There's reasons for it, but it's kind of interesting that they go from 24 to 16, but still likely MERB. The USS Alabama, that's the one they show in the movie, it is a real Ohio-class nuclear sub. They didn't create a name. This one entered into service in 84, and it's still active today. And if you are looking and you're watching the movie, there is a shot of the actual submarine. It's when, in the movie, they dive into the ocean. Tony Scott was in a helicopter, and they were just filming, looking for stuff, and they were told, stop filming this nuclear submarine. It's about to go on patrol. But sure enough, it went down into the ocean, which is exactly the shot that Tony Scott wanted anyways. And if you've seen the movie On the Beach, not the original version with Gregory Peck, but the remake TV version from 2000 with, I think, Aman Assad and some other people, they reused footage of Crimson Tide for that movie, and that's what the USS Alabama is there. So these are what the subs do, but what role do they serve in the deterrent plan versus, say, a missile silo or a bomber? And I'll let Will or Geoff, whatever you feel like you want to jump into this.
I actually just gave a webinar a couple of weeks ago on nuclear attack submarines versus Ohio-class submarines. Because actually, nuclear submarines have been a lot in the news here in Norway as well. Not because of the Australia submarine deal. Because of Russia, the United States has been sending Virginia-class attack subs to Norwegian ports, and Norwegians are getting nervous about that. And basically, there is a lot of misunderstanding in the general populace, as there is in the United States, that these nuclear submarines are nuclear armed, which they are not, right? They're not. The United States is not sending nuclear weapons to Norway. Submersive ship ballistic nuclear. Right, that is the nuclear missile submarine. They serve a unique role in the deterrence posture of the United States of America. Bombers are very visible. They take off from airfields. You can see it on satellite imagery. It sends a signal when you deploy them to a region. We do this a lot with North Korea when they are doing something that we don't like testing missiles or conducting military exercises. We fly B-52s to Guam, or somewhere else in the region where it's very visible. That sends a message that, hey, we're watching you. We can nuke you if we want. The silos kind of serve that purpose every day. They're just there, right? They're there. They're visible. Heaven forbid, if they go on high alert, the silo doors are opened and satellite imagery can pick that up. As I hinted at, these submarines are out in the ocean on deterrence patrols 24/7. It's not like we send them out, like the United States sends them out when there's a crisis. They're always there. They're always watching, and they're always ready to fire. Now, if there is a crisis, one of the submarines, one of the boomers, as they are colloquially called, will be redirected, but no one will ever know that. Information about where they are is always top secret. Trump spilled the beans on the location once of a boomer when he was meeting with Sergei Lavrov in the Oval Office, and that was a huge scandal. It's we don't do this ever. And the reason for that is submarines they are the backbone of our deterrence posture. They are the guarantee. You can take out our silos. You can take out our bombers. You can never take out our submarines that you don't know where are and you can't target. So you attack us, you will have, Geoff, what did you say was just shy of 1,000 warheads? Guaranteed. Might not be today or tomorrow, but by next week, you will be gone. You will be wiped off the face of the planet. That is what the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines do. So yeah, the portrayal here in the movie, it makes for a great movie, makes for a lot of drama and tension, but they get a ton of stuff right in this movie. But that is one kind of fundamental strategy thing that they get wrong.
The SSBNs are the secure second strike, right? It is the backbone of deterrence. Should anybody launch a nuke at the United States, like Will said, if they happen to somehow magically take out every single bomber base and every single ICBM in the Midwest, there are still submarines in the oceans that nobody can find. I think that we keep about 5 of these in range of their targets at all times. So like you said, we have 14 of them. I think there's 8 in the Pacific Theater and 6 in the Atlantic Theater. But no matter who's in refit, or if some of them are coming off patrol or on patrol or still deployed, there are always 5 that are ready to go at all times, that are in range of their targets in Russia and China. So they're always ready. And it's that threat, like Will says, that the United States believes ensures its deterrent. This is why other people won't launch nuclear weapons at us.
And it's the nice thing about them too is that if you are not 100% sure that maybe there's a missile that's incoming, but oh, you know what? It's just one. That's weird. Why would you send just one? Maybe there's an error, like the dozens of errors that we've seen in the past. You could, as a president, make a decision. I'm going to wait to see if this is actually a target that's going to hit. And if it does, and it is a precursor to something else, you do have the submarines available for you. That is something that people consider as not always probably the number one option for people in terms of responding to things, but it's also part of the idea why you have these submarines.
Now, interestingly enough, Tim, like right now you mentioned that we're making these decisions about the future of the nuclear arsenal. There are decisions being made in Congress right now that are going to affect the nuclear arsenal for the rest of our lifetime. And that includes these Columbia-class submarines. And I think it's interesting to note here, whether for political reasons or defense contract reasons or whatever, there is a lot of argument about whether this is a secure second strike anymore. I think Angus King last week just said, well, there's a possibility that within the lifespan of the Columbia-class submarine, that somebody will come up with a way to find them, and they use that as sort of a strange reason for why we need to keep the silo missiles, which doesn't make any sense. But it is an interesting question. It's something that's being discussed right now, as is what sort of Will was alluding to. There's a decision potentially to put nuclear weapons back on just nuclear-powered submarines, the attack submarines. So there's a lot going on in this sphere right now.
It's always fascinating when you think about nuclear triad, and the bombers are, they serve a certain role, and they cost a little bit somewhere in the middle between, submarines are very, very expensive. You think that they serve all these roles, but if you want them, you have to pay for them. They're very, very expensive. Silos, once you dig the hole and you put the missile together and you design a new missile, the cost is relatively low on a year-to-year basis. So it's a decision. Where do you want to spend your money? Which do you think is the most secure? These debates have been going on forever. We used to have these things also on surface fleet, and we used to have them as artillery, boat-destroying mines. There were nuclear weapon exploding.
Those artillery shells, everything.
So these are all debates that are going to be hopefully at some point we'll stop. At some point, if Geoff and crew are able to succeed at their mission, but that's certainly something that we'll probably never stop debating this. And, it's interesting that even this debate weaves its way into the movie as well. Because one of the scenes we see when we meet all of the crew and finally everyone's together, Denzel was accepted on board to replace the XO that Ramsey previously had, who was sick. One small thing about that is that most of these crews have what are called gold and I think it's gold and blue teams. I think that's the color designations. And for most of these patrols, there are two different separate crews, so that at any point these crews can be switched out when they're on patrols. They can go port, switch out the crews, and come back. So the idea, like Ramsey's XO is sick, well, okay, you would just go to the next one that was already there. But anyways, fair enough. We meet the crew. They're cracking wise. They're playing poker. They're kind of hazing some of the younger sailors. They're talking about submarine movies like we do. Very relatable stuff. But then over dinner, there's this discussion debate about whether or not one of the crew members says, we should just nuke Vladimir and Russia now. Why not? This is just as legitimate as bombing with atomic weapons Japan. Hunter, Denzel Washington, kind of hedges on whether or not he thought this would be appropriate. Captain Ramsey, of course, is like, I would do it again, I would do it a third time. He says, I'm simple, I don't overthink things, you give me an order, I'm going to launch the missiles. I don't need to know why an order is coming through, I just need to know where, when, and how many missiles. And Denzel's like, I don't know. I think the Navy would want us to think about why the order was given, and they keep going back and forth on this. They discuss what's the purpose of war and all of this stuff, and it's really a fascinating, deep debate, kind of really in the first third of the movie, but it really defines, I think, the characters well and their motivations.
What don't you understand?
Rodchenko is a fanatic, okay? He's a potential Hitler. Somebody should just step up and shoot him. He's a dangerous lunatic, and he's threatening nuclear war, and he means it.
What's that make us, since we're the only nation ever dropped a nuclear bomb on anyone?
It makes us a prime target. There's half a dozen other third world countries with atom bombs who'd love to drop one on us.
That's right. That's why we should drop one on them. What are you, a communist? You have a problem with us dropping nuclear bombs at Japan?
Shut up, Doctor.
You think it was a mistake, Mr. Hunter?
Sir?
Using the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Well, if I thought that, sir, I wouldn't be here.
Interesting way you put that. Very carefully. Somebody asked me if we should have bombed Japan. A simple yes
by all means, sir. I don't mean to suggest that you're indecisive, Mr. Hunter. Rickover gave me my command, a checklist, a target, and a button to push. All I had to know is how to push it. They'd tell me when. They seem to want you to know why.
I would hope they'd want us all to know why, sir.
War is a continuation of politics by other means. Von Clausewitz.
I think, sir, that what he was actually trying to say was a little more
complicated.
Yes, the purpose of war is to serve a political end, but the true nature of war is to serve itself.
I'm very impressed.
I just think that in the nuclear world, the true enemy can't be destroyed. In the nuclear world, the true enemy is war itself.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Denzel Washington's character is basically accused of being a ring knocker. Like they make kicks about it later. Like, you went to Annapolis and Harvard. Oh God. He says something that I think is very powerful. He says, in the nuclear world, the true enemy cannot be destroyed. The true enemy is war itself. And this whole conversation that you're talking about the one commander just says, just tell me how many and where they are, like that kind of thing. This reminds me of Harold Herring, who's a launch officer for the Air Force in a silo in the silo realm of nuclear weapons, who in the 70s basically asked a question in a training drill. Well, how can I know that an order that I receive is a legitimate one? Or how can I even know that it's coming from a sane president, right? The Air Force basically drummed him out of the service. We assume that orders are valid. Like, the orders that are in the president's nuclear football are all pre-vetted as being legal orders. And I'm using air quotes here. So if the president decides that he wants to nuke Iran or Russia or whatever, using any of those, there's no question about the legality of it. But there is still a question, is the man at the top, or is the person giving the order, is he in a right state of mind? But we assume that the process has already weeded those people out. So when it actually gets down to the mechanics of how you launch nuclear weapons, even though there's a human chain of responsibility, it's just supposed to go off. There's no stopping to question whether or not an order is valid or not. It's assumed that it is, and that's a fascinating thing that happens in a microcosm in this movie, but is one that and I know we're going to talk about later, but is one that has just happened very recently, is the president in a state, that where he can make an order like that. But I think it's interesting that it's dealt with here in a smaller scale. Is the captain in his right mind when he decides to make an order to launch?
Will?
Just going back to the beginning of Geoff started talking about, right, this idea that, like, when it comes to nuclear weapons, like, the only enemy is the war itself, right? Like, and this is the idea that there are no winners in nuclear war, there are only losers. And then going back to the point that the sailor made in the movie is like, oh, well, what's the difference between just, nuking Ratchenko, like, right now, and what we did to the Japanese? The difference is what happened with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a nuclear war. They didn't have nuclear weapons to fight back with. It was a nuclear massacre. So we didn't have that, right? Like, there was no, like, the enemy is the war itself. That can't happen. That was just like, okay, we're going to kill a couple 100,000 people, call it a day. Once the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons, the world changed forever, right? Like, now you had 2 nuclear armed states going at it. And now we have 9, like the dynamics are just completely different from what they were back in 1945. And it's, it's a Pandora's box. We're never going to be able to put the lid back on that dynamic until we get rid of nuclear weapons, period.
Totally. And it's something that gets brought up again later that we'll talk about later. But this idea of nuclear war fighting versus and they actually call it nuclear holocaust. There's a very difference of opinion, and it's something I'm really looking forward to talking about.
Well, before we are able to do any of those debates, we see in the movie there's kind of all of a sudden a big, massive fire in the cooking galley. While Hunter's in there trying to put out the fire and save some of the crew members, Captain Ramsey decides, you know what, this is the best time to run a nuclear missile launch system readiness drill. They run into high alert, and us as viewers get to see the process of how they would go about this if it was real. They get one of these emergency action messages, the EAMs. There's a big, light that says EAM incoming message, and they get a printout like a fax machine, and they get their order, and it's very clear you're supposed to do this. And they mention over the radio, this is a drill, but they still want to get through and run through the process. You see Hunter He runs into action, removes his firefighting suit, and is there to authenticate the message that it's legitimate according to him. They open up a safe. They bring out this little plastic biscuit. I actually think in Submarines it's called a cookie. They crack it open. They check it against the message that they just received, and it says that it's legitimate. They go to launch depth and everything. But while this is happening, of course, one of the crew members is actually dying from the fire situation. So the drill is canceled, and then there's this big debate that between Hunter and Ramsey whether or not it was a good time to run this drill. Hunter thinks it was a bad idea. Ramsey's like, nope, in the middle of war, sometimes you are in these chaotic situations, and we're still get the order to launch. It's more important that we do what we need to do. It's fascinating. You see what's going to happen here in the rest of this movie, because Ramsey says, look, I don't want a kiss ass. I want you to express your doubts to me if you have concerns, but don't do it in public. Do it in private, and if you can't get into a private place, then, shut up and do your action. Because he has this great quote where he says,
those sailors out there are just boys. Boys who are training to do a terrible and unthinkable thing. If that ever occurs, the only reassurance they'll have that they're doing the proper thing is going to derive from their unqualified belief in the unified chain of command. It means, in a missile drill, they hear your voice right after mine, without hesitation. We're here to preserve democracy, not to practice it.
They do a pretty good job of describing and portraying EAMs, the emergency action messages. These things kind of were part of our nuclear command and control system since 1981. They're ID codes that are created. They go out from either command, or they can be launched by the airborne command post, which is kind of a backup to strategic command, but they're sent out through a variety of different ways. Sometimes it's radio, sometimes it's low frequency, and then it's cables, a couple different ways so that there's lots of backups. But Submarines would get those things and then, follow their order.
I want to go on the record in saying that I am 110% on board with Ramsey's take on this. This is the absolute opportune time to do a drill. There's nothing more stressful than having to make the decision on whether or not to end the world, right? Launch nuclear weapons. So yeah, fires on submarines are probably the most scariest thing that can possibly happen. Everybody's tensions are running high. You can't recreate that scenario. So yeah, that call, I was 110% on board with. Geoff, what do you think?
I think that this scene perfectly encapsulates the three nuclear themes in this movie, which is, first, are orders valid, right? Is the person making them doing it right? And they even set up the two-man system that the Navy has in place, right? Second, there's confusion in the time of war, and sometimes orders can be misinterpreted, or they could be misunderstood, or they may not be valid. So there needs to be a check about whether or not that's right. And third is this idea of the costs of war, is that Denzel makes a comment after this. He says, we're talking about the lives of 1 billion people here, right? We have to be sure that this is right. And so, those sort of self-reinforcing things, asking this handful of officers to make a decision about the fate of the world, like Will says, in one of the most stressful environments possible already, throwing a fact that somebody may be shooting at you, or that there's a fire in the galley, all of those things are even heightened even more. So, I think that in a microcosm, again, the submarine is the perfect place to break down these three themes that are so critical about talking about the use of nuclear weapons.
And I think the movie is some good screenwriting, because even in the course of a drill, someone dies. That is, even in a drill, if that's what happens during a drill, let's see what happens when the real thing hits, which is right now in the movie. On day 6 of their patrol, they get another EAM message. This appears not to be a drill. It says, National Military Command Center, Washington, D.C., orders USS Alabama to set DEFCON 3, and that Vladimir now has the launch codes of his 25 nuclear missiles. I guess the idea here is, if he now takes that next step, if Vladimir takes the next step of fueling the missiles, now that he has the codes, as seen by military satellites, we don't have to get into whether or not military satellites see in real time or any of those things. They don't. Spoiler alert. He'll be able to launch in 1 hour once, starting to fuel the missiles. We're in a pretty tense situation here.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth saying, this is a very, whether or not Russian rebels are going to attack the United States and or Japan, which I thought was an interesting quote. I have no idea what they would attack Japan for, instead of NATO.
Vladimir he had some bad sushi one day when he visited. And his plane, he's like...
Yeah, but this is a real potential scenario, right? And this phrase that you just said, Tim, which is, I think people can sort of laugh off, is totally accurate. There is there is room and guidance in the U.S. nuclear psyop for a preemptive nuclear strike, right? If we think that someone is preparing to attack the United States with nuclear weapons and has credible intelligence saying so, we can nuke them first. That's totally, even in the sort of current Joe Biden thinking of the national nuclear use parameters, that's a real thing. And I think this brings up an interesting conversation that, policy conversation is about this idea of no first use, and why people want to bring it up, which lends itself to this whole movie itself here later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it gets even more heightened when 6 days later on the patrol, the crew hears one of those Akula class attack subs, the Russian ones that the dissident group is now managing. We talked about that earlier, that we previewed it. Chekhov's Akula class has arrived, and now the crew, while it's trying to hide from this attack submarine, receives another actually authenticated EAM that now it's time to launch. They say that the Russian missiles are being fueled. They're going to launch in an hour. We're now at DEFCON 2, which is a really high state of alert. Cuban Missile Crisis level style of alert. One step away from active war. And they received the message which says to launch 10 of their Trident missiles with a target package. And they keep repeating the number here, SLBM 64741/2. So as you mentioned, Geoff, earlier, that's one of the packages that they're told to do. It's a target set. It's probably a target set that they worked on before they left. This is this missile field most likely, and this is this naval place. Here's go ahead and do these launches, of these 10 missiles, and they get their authentication code. And the tubes are prepped for launch. The captain goes to get his launch key from the stateroom. They mentioned very clearly that in 14 minutes, which is just about the time, 14-ish minutes, 15 minutes is usually how long it takes once you start this process. In order to be able to launch, they're going to be at the depth and be ready to go. But what happens next? This is not, a simple, obviously the movie is not only 20, 30 minutes long. There's another complication that gets thrown into this.
It's a great scene leading up to this complication is exactly what Will said, is that, things are intense and confusing. They're rigged for torpedo warfare, right? They think that they're going to get into a shooting fight with the Kula, with the Russian, and they say, if he so much as opens a tube, or we're going to blast him out of the water. And then immediately they get that EAM signal, and he goes, secure from torpedo warfare, we're going to missile warfare. And they change, and even though they're being targeted by a Russian submarine, they start going to launch depth and stuff, that, which I think is crazy. But then what you're talking about happens, and they get a contravening order, or maybe a contravening order.
So they try to go and run through their mission plan, but because of the fact that the Akula class is here, they have to go quiet. So through a combination of things, they lose connection to the National Military Command Center. Before they do, partial EAM comes through. This message is confusing. Why would you send another EAM when you were given as an order to launch? So Hunter, Denzel Washington, thinks that they must be told to abort the launch. Why else? Why would you send another confirmation? Is there what, never mind, let's put 15 missiles on the target. Hunter's confused about what's going on here, so he wants to get back up to the depth so they can receive the message again. But Ramsey's like, nope, we don't want to get the attention of the Akula class, maintain the launch process, we're proceeding as if we need to launch. Through a series of kind of weird situations, malfunctions of a variety of different equipment, Alabama gets on the radar of the Akula class. They get torpedoes fired against them.
On the sonar, Tim.
Yeah,
okay.
Sonar. Bing. Several pings happen, and they just barely miss the Alabama. But it's pretty crazy. There's a lot of debate between Ramsey and Hunter about what this partial EAM message might say. They're ready to launch in about 4 minutes, but Hunter says no. The message is probably about maybe to abort. We don't know. We think that there's this debate about are there other submarines in the region, like we talked about earlier. Maybe they can receive, maybe their radio is working, and if we hold maybe we'll be able to, still launch later if it turns out to be the case, but at least these other subs in the region can deal with it. Ramsey says, no, I need to assume that all those submarines are destroyed. There's lots of back and forth here. Right, Geoff?
Well, and there's this interesting thing, because the Navy regulations that they talk about, which are true, is like, in the absence of a clear and countermanding order, the orders that you have in hand stand, right? So he says, listen, I have an order to launch nuclear weapons. Otherwise, the United States is going to be nuked, right? Like that's a real big, it's a big deal. What Denzel is arguing is like, well, maybe a contravening order has come through. We don't know. We have to figure that out. Sort of this weird, like, rules as written or rules as intended kind of thing, because if we start a nuclear war, the Denzel's point is like, that's even worse. Like, and we don't know. We need more information. He's making this technical argument. Like, listen, like, there's other subs that are in range, too. They can do our job if we can't. And Gene Hackman says, well, that's disobeying our direct order. People are counting on us. And so it's this interesting, like, you're the college boy kind of understanding about theory versus me who knows the real deal here, kind of thing.
It's hard to tell who's right. You can talk about, well, no one's right because they all are debating about whether or not to kill people with nuclear weapons. But from the process perspective, that as it laid out, like that they received a partial message. The movie kind of fudges this a little bit later, which I'll talk about later. About what the part of the message that they do get, whether or not it would be enough of a hint, but they don't receive the full message, and they're pretty strict about that. There can't be typos in the message. It has to be very clear about what the order was going to be.
These are these people's jobs, right? We can get into all the discussion we want about whether or not using nuclear weapons first is ethical or, but like, this is their job. This is what they train for every day. The question is, who is right about doing their job right to the letter of the law? Is it the letter of the law, or is it the intended meaning of the law that's happening here, which is an interesting conversation.
Well, they get into this at the end of the movie, right? When they do like this debrief of like the whole thing. It's like they were both right. there is this like crazy split in like naval policy. They've set up a hierarchy for a reason, but they also try to install some safeguards regarding the authority to launch nuclear weapons. So like, they're both right, and in the end, they're both wrong.
Well, at least the question of whether or not the message is, the new EAM, the second one that came through, it's muddled about whether or not that might be a countervailing order or not. But Ramsey makes a very clear break-in process when the XO is supposed to be the second person to authenticate the message. And if he's not agreeing to also give his approval to launch, you're not allowed to, as captain or commanding officer, you can't replace the XO. Because otherwise, like if the president makes an order to launch and the people around him decide, I'm not going to assist you, or I'm not going to authenticate that you're the president, even though you've given the codes, the president could fire that individual and then pick someone else. They can't do that on a submarine. So the chief of staff on the submarine, I forget what the actual term is for the person on the sub, but he makes a point like the captain is breaking the rules here, so he allows the XO to essentially take over.
The chief of the boat. Yeah, the chief of the boat.
The chief of the boat agrees with Hunter, like, no, this is very clearly a break-in protocol, and orders the commander to be returned to his stateroom.
It's like the chief of the boat was like the captain's closest ally, like the whole time, and then he's the one who makes the break. He's like, no, dude, you're totally like.
Captain, I cannot concur.
Repeat my command.
Sir, we don't know what this message means. Our target package could have changed.
You repeat this order, or I'll find somebody who will.
No, you won't, sir.
You're relieved of your position. Cobb, remove Mr. Hunter from the control room. Get Lieutenant Zimmerman here right now.
No, sir. I do not concur, and I do not recognize your authority to relieve me under command under Navy regulations.
Cobb, arrest this man and get him out of here!
Under operating procedures governing the release of nuclear weapons, we cannot launch our missiles unless both you and I agree.
Cobb, what are you waiting for?
Sir, this is expressly why your command must be repeated. It requires my assent. I do not give it. And furthermore, you continue upon this course and insist upon this launch without confirming this message first, I will be
Chief of the boat,
backed by the rules of precedence,
Captain, Commanding Officer of the USS Alabama. I order you to place the XO under arrest on the charge of
Navy regulations.
I say again, I order you to place the XO under arrest on the charge of mutiny. Cobb!
Captain, please, the XO is right. We can't launch unless he concurs.
and this is the thing that we really got to focus in on, is that Gene Hackman says, listen, if you won't authenticate this order, I'll find somebody who will. And that's the point. That's the point where they're like, no, that's wrong. That's against naval regulations, and that's where and even the chief, who's the senior enlisted man on the boat, Denzel Washington, says, thank you, chief. And he says, don't fucking tell me thank you. I'm doing what's right here. It's not because I like you, right. And I think that's a very, very good moment.
Yeah, it's great. So the new plan is we're going to get the radio working, because for some reason they have one radio and it's not working. Of course, the movie, needs to happen. So they let this radio scenario play out. On an actual boomer, there are so many backup systems for just this situation. All of them in the movie are not working. So they say, all right, we have some time. It's about 40 minutes left before the dissidents have the ability to launch, and when everything gets fueled up, let's try to get the radio working to find out what happened with this other EAM that was released.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think is important to know here is that this sort of standoff between the captain and Denzel Washington, this is not, again, this isn't a fictional thing, right? Mm-hmm. Like this has happened before. Luckily not in the United States, but just as unluckily in the Soviet Union, right? I think and we talked about this before, but Vasily Arkhipov, mm-hmm. right? Who, strangely enough, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets launched 5 nuclear-armed submarines, and they had nuclear-armed torpedoes. And on one of the submarines, he was the executive officer. But strangely enough, because of weird Soviet Navy stuff, he was also the commodore in charge of all of the flotilla. And so when the captain of that ship decided that he was going to launch this nuclear-armed torpedo at the American carrier battle group, he said, no, I get a say too, because I am the commodore of this flotilla. And there was a standoff just like this, and it became a huge deal. And basically this guy, saved the world from World War III, and then, essentially was reprimanded for it after the fact, right? Because he didn't follow his orders. Like, there's a very real situation that's happened before.
And if I remember right, he thought that that a war had already started because there were some death charges that were released. The Russians interpreted that as a direct, war was already started. Now let's go ahead. And then that was the, but wait moment. Let's think through the consequences of what was happening here.
Going back to that drill, right, with the fire and the drill, like how there's like, it's creating all these tensions. That's what happened on that Soviet submarine, the B-59. So that was designed to operate the North Atlantic in cold waters. It was sent down to Cuba in the Caribbean in warm waters. So I think the average temperature on that sub was like 115 degrees in the cool spots of the sub. In the engine, it was up to 150 degrees Fahrenheit, right?
Air conditioning broke, and
they were passing out from like heat exhaustion, like they were at their like wits end. And so basically what happened, like that captain just started having a mental breakdown. Like when the depth charges started going off around him, he just like snapped. So that again, going back to that drill, right? Like when you are under that much pressure and you have control over enough firepower to destroy the world, that's a pretty bad combo.
It's scary, and it's even worse in the movie because as soon as Hunter takes command, the Akula class finds them again. Actually, before USS Alabama is able to destroy that attack sub, one more torpedo gets away and damages the USS Alabama, which is sinking. Captain Hunter now has to make a determination that he's going to sacrifice some crew members in the bilge room in order to let the rest of the submarine survive. The crew, while some of them were willing to support this, it depends from what perspective you're looking at, either a mutiny or having someone resign their post because if they're crazy. Either way,
the perennial Navy question, right? Yeah, is it a mutiny or is a man doing his duty? And it's whoever the victor is, whoever wins, to decide who the mutineers are. Like,
well, then we see some of the characters that we liked before. Now they're getting mixed up in the counter mutiny. Someone wants to take back over, let Ramsey get back into control because people have died in this bilge bay accident. They try to go after. They know there's certain people you need to have in order to do this launch, and one of them is Vigo, because Vigo is the guy who is friends with both Hunter and with Ramsey. He is the weapons operator, the weapons engineer. So it's his job to, actually be doing a lot of the launching, and he's part of the process. So they know they need to get him. At first, he resists this effort, but then he's convinced that, nope, my family's at stake here. You see his kind of kids and stuff earlier in the movie. So he decides to give them access to a small arms cache, this kind of counter mutiny group, and they take back the command. Hunter realizes something's off, so he gives the keys to the submarine to one of his sailors that we meet earlier in the movie that he trusts. At this point in the film, the Russian dissidents are about 14 minutes away from being able to launch. So he still wants Hunter to try to get the radio fixed, and that's the order he gives before Ramsey and his crew basically take back over.
And this is where the dogs could sense evil part happens. When Ramsey gives that order, the smartest dog in the world, the Jack Russell Terrier, starts barking and like, no, this is bad. And he's like, shut up, you don't know what you're talking about. Like,
should have listened to the dog.
Totally.
Hunter, he brings up a point here that I think is worth exploring later, that if the submarine is wrong and that they're not actually fueling the missiles and the Russians get upset, what the Russians are going to do, the Russians being not the dissidents, but the actual people who are legitimately in charge of the country at that time, they're going to respond by destroying the United States and kill 1 billion people if we were to launch there. I think we can talk about at the end of the movie whether or not that actually would be the scenario, but that is I think the movie draws on our understanding of like war potential accidents starting, back and forth, like the Terminator situation, what Skynet did, with the United States. It draws on that area anyways. And that's the argument that Hunter makes to everybody on his counter crew to get back control over the ship. Wanting to note here, the movie tells us that the dissidents are 14 minutes away from being able to launch their weapons. I think the movie ignores this, but a little dirty secret is, if we're actually at this point, whatever we're doing on the submarine matters not, because it takes about 14 to 15 minutes for the U.S. naval submarines to be ready to launch, and it takes about 15 minutes for them to reach their target, even if they're right on the coast. So at this point, it's too late. If this is actually taking place, it's too late. Like the Russians, if the dissidents are actually going to launch as soon as they're fueled up, unless for some reason they decide to wait, but I don't know why you would, because it's clear enough that the other side's seeing that you're fueling the missiles. One small thing is that it doesn't matter, but the movie's exciting, so we kind of ignore it. But there's no way, even if they were to launch right now, the U.S. naval submarine, they wouldn't reach and destroy those missiles before those missiles from the distance would be in the air.
Denzel Washington's character even says that. I think he says something about missiles passing each other in the air, which is, I think, sort of the chief foible about this nuclear warfighting strategy. One side sees the other nukes coming. They go, oh, well, it's time to get rid of ours. And so they launch theirs back. So literally any nuclear weapons from that first strike, if it's a counter force strike, would be hitting empty silos. Right? And so it's like, what's the point then? Like why do this if it like literally won't have an effect? Like given whether or not early warning systems work or not, like they will see it coming and it's just going to hit empty silos. And I think that is sort of a fascinating conversation about this nuclear war fighting thing that is so prevalent in spaces like this.
Really good segue, by the way, and this gets to kind of like the next point here, right? So after Hunter leads this kind of like leads the counter mutiny, right? Peter Wepp, played by Viggo Mortensen, right? He basically disobeys the order to fire the actual missiles, right? He doesn't respond when the order comes down from the captain.
He refuses to open the safe that has the trigger.
Yes, the captain and his goons go down there, hold the gun up to his head, saying, we're going to shoot you in the face, like blah, blah, blah. And then obviously they can't shoot him in the face because he's the only guy who knows the code. So that's going to be self-defeating anyways. But then Gene Hackman's like, oh, well, this dude over here doesn't know the code, so I'm going to shoot him and hold him hostage, right? And he has this great quote, right? And he says,
millions of lives at stake here, Peter. Don't make a dumb decision.
And then Viggo Mortensen's response is, okay, well, don't shoot this one poor sailor guy. I'm going to open the safe that is going to guarantee the death of tens of millions of people, right? If not billions. And this goes to that, like, missiles passing each other. It's like, there are no winners in nuclear war. As soon as one flies, they all fly. You're doomed, right? in the scheme of things, if you are in a situation where you think that there has been an order that came in, right, partially, it may or may not be like countermanding the previous order, but there's a chance. So you're weighing your two options. There's a chance that we don't shoot these things and everything's fine, or we shoot these things and guaranteed
everybody
destruction.
dies.
Yeah, everybody dies. So
except for this one sailor that's next to him for a short amount of time until he dies of radiation poisoning later.
But this is also the other thing that I find so fascinating about this scene in particular is this is where we finally have a good guy, bad guy. Because this is clearly where Gene Hackman steps over the line. He's holding a pistol to an innocent man's head, a petty officer that works for him, threatening another officer to kill another officer if he doesn't do what he says. And then you're finally like, this guy's lost his marbles, right? Like, and Vigo even says like, Captain, like what are you doing? And it was funny because he a great scene. As soon as Viggo Mortensen screams Captain, he turns around and he lowers his pistol, and you can see like all the blood's drained out of his face. Like, what am I doing?
Yeah.
And I love that scene. But I think it gets back to sort of that first theme. Is this a valid order anymore? Or is this guy just decided that this is what he's going to do? And like, this is his crusade now. This is about his leadership. This has become personal. This is no longer about the security of the United States. This is about one man's, personal crusade here.
Like what the poster told us.
Yeah.
So have you all come across this thing called the Fischer Protocols? It's a thought experiment. It was written by a philosopher who wrote for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. And the idea there is how do you make the decision to use nuclear weapons something that is viscerally clear to the person who's making the decision? Like, if you look at numbers on a spreadsheet and you talk about mega deaths and how many people are killed, it's very, whitewashed. It's desensitized. Like, the idea of killing this many people by pushing a quote-unquote button doesn't really get you there mentally about what you're about to do, so you might be more willing to do it. So the Fischer Protocol is okay, great, but the key to launch the weapon is inside of this random person's body, and you have to cut it out and kill them and get blood on your hands before you get the key. So this, to me, in the movie, is like a reverse version of that. It's like, you have to save this one person, and if you do, then all these other people are going to die. It's kind of like a weird, bizarro Fischer Protocol thing. But we get into the Fischer Protocol because it's wonderfully displayed in the HBO series, The Leftovers. So we did a podcast on that. That was pretty cool. But we're near the end of the movie here, so we can kind of wrap up a little bit. There's this arms standoff, try to figure out, what's going to happen. The Vigo gives Ramsey the trigger. He goes to pull the trigger, but somewhere else, the captain's key is removed, kind of meant that the tubes can't fire. There's a standoff about, all right, you know what? We have a little bit of time left. Let's get to the EAM message. Let's get to that depth. And it turns out the EAM was to terminate the launch. The radio is working now, and it's very clear that Hunter was quote-unquote right the whole time, with the idea that this was something that was telling them to stop, because Vladimir's rebellion was put down. There's even a note in the EAM that the Akula class ones were ordered to return back to the Russian bases. Hunter resumes command of the ship, and Ramsey goes back to the stateroom with his dog, with his brilliant, all-knowing animal. Back on land, as Will kind of previewed with us earlier, both men are brought in front of a military tribunal, and the admiral, who's played by Jason Robards from The Day After and all other nuke movies, they talk about, this is a hard one to decide, because both of you are technically both right and wrong in different places. It would have been nice if you could have worked out your differences more professionally, but Hunter is deemed to be, the person who made the decision that was in the best interest of the United States. So he's given command of a submarine, actually at the recommendation of Ramsey, who is allowed to retire early. They shake hands at the end and I guess get mutual, respect. And the movie ends with a text screen that says, as of January 1996, primary authority and ability to fire nuclear weapons will no longer rest with U.S. submarine commanders. Principal control will reside with the President of the United States. Which, I don't understand that. I thought about that since I saw this movie again. I still don't understand that because the movie describes that procedure in that way. The president issues an order, it's authenticated, and then they launch, and there's no way to, like, I don't understand why this is different. I tried to find some historical description of this, like how did submarine launch authority change in the 90s? I don't see any description of this, so maybe I'm wrong about this. If listeners can answer this, probably Steven Schwartz is going to message me and tell me the right answer to this, but I couldn't figure out what this was, because the launch authority is done pretty, and the procedure is portrayed pretty well here. President makes an authorization for launching, and the submarine commandos follow a thing. Do you guys have any idea what this final text is that's supposed to make us feel better?
I think we just need to wait for Steven Schwartz to weigh in on this, because I'm 100% in agreement with you. This seems the way it works. Like, it's not like the president can actually push a button and launch the weapons from the White House. He has to send that command to the sub that gets authenticated, and then there are protocols in place for them to launch, but they cannot do it without the authority of the president.
This might be some sort of comment about pre-delegation of authority to launch, but
But there isn't in this movie. There is no pre-delegation.
Yeah, I don't know. Jeff?
I think that this quote at the end, this blurb of text, is actually the scariest thing about the whole movie. Because it's like in the 90s, you're like supposed to be left with the warm and fuzzies. Like, oh, thank God the president's in control of this now. This can never happen. And we've literally just in the past month been going through this thing where we found out that it turns out that the military had to step in and make sure that the president couldn't launch nuclear weapons because he was having a psychotic break after January 6th. Like, and it's like, what a way to come full circle, man. You know, like, brings up this fascinating conversation about nuclear use.
Yeah.
Let's dive in here. Let's get super critical real quick, because I know Will's got to head out here. How well do you think that this movie portrays some of these debates? Because the U.S. Navy didn't like it. Once they found about the plot and kind of what was involved, they refused to help Tony Scott. Despite the fact that he probably got them most of their F-14 pilots for generations. I mean, they almost got me. My vision wasn't so bad. The movie does try to delve into some of these things. It delves into nuclear deterrence debates. It delves into policy debates. It's pretty interesting. You know, we all don't necessarily like nuclear weapons, but if you have them, you know, should we be in favor of a command and control system that allows this kind of scenario to play out?
9 out of 10. Like, the fact that the Navy didn't like it means that it's worth its salt, right? Like, I mean, really, like, I mean, the U.S. military as an organization, it doesn't like independent thinking, right? Like, that is the antithesis of what they're about, like hierarchy, deference, like, you shall do what you're ordered to do. This movie, like, had an eerily accurate portrayal of how the actual, like, launch process works, how life is on a submarine, the tensions, the pressures. It threw in some of the philosophical debates. If anything, that was the most unrealistic part. Was like, you wouldn't have any of this philosophical debate because these guys follow orders, right? But you know, it made for a great movie. As Jeff said, I too had not seen this movie since I was like a pre-teenager, like a teenager in the 90s. And I'd totally forgotten how awesome this movie was. Like, I remember really liking it, but I think, you know, now as a nuclear weapons policy expert, like, I was just like, oh my God, there is so much good stuff here. Like, I was like practically drooling as I was watching it. And I was like, oh man, this is great.
There are some movies that I've watched again since entering this field that are better. And for me now, you know, because what I want in this podcast is to find some of these things, and it's an interesting reaction. Like, I watch a film and I either can put aside the issues and say this is still a good film if it portrays things inaccurately, or if it does it right and tells a good story and gets at, you know, a message to people that isn't completely destroyed by this final text on the screen. I think it's great. It's great when you see movies like this. I think The Sum of All Fears to me is a movie that, after watching it again, entering this field, is, you know, are there things incorrect about it? Yeah, but most of it's pretty good, and it tells a pretty fun story. This is one of those. Well, there are definitely some movies that I may have liked as a kid and then watch nowadays, and I go, gosh, this is really annoying. Like, to me, it's a lot of like the Mission Impossible movies, or even most recently, like Spies Like Us, a film that I really enjoyed as a comedy, you know, as a kid, and then watched it recently and was like, this is all completely bonkers. Reversing a missile, you know, order to detonate in hacking it's nuts. Like, this is silly. But anyways, Does it ruin the movie for me? I don't know. But Geoff, do you ever run into these situations?
The thing that I really walked away with this film is during that ultimate scene there, right, where it's Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington. They're standing on the con and they're trying to figure out who's right and who's wrong. They're waiting for the message to come through. And he says, "You know what you'll get, son? You'll get a nuclear war." And he says, "I think you mean a nuclear holocaust, sir." You know, like that difference of opinion about what it is. They're talking about the same thing, but two very different visions of what that same thing is, you know, and I think that this is fascinating. The U.S. government, you know, and the military and the Navy, whoever it is, they like to call it nuclear war because, it, like you said, it's sort of sanitizing. Like, this is the United States. We've been fighting wars forever, and it doesn't bother anybody here at home. How much has any American, you know, that isn't in the service or have a family member in the service suffered from the past 20 years of the war on terror? Hardly anybody. You know, our taxes didn't even go up. So, like, thinking of it in terms of war, oh, it's controlled. Oh, it, you know, we'd be able to. You know, it's there's a science behind it. But what Denzel Washington says, no, this is nuclear holocaust, because no matter who wins, everybody loses. You know, like what Will said earlier. I think is a really interesting dynamic at play in this movie. Also, just, you know, a couple of things about today where we're at, you know, there's been a serious problem in the Navy with the competency of naval officers, right? I think it's something like a third of naval officers were brought out of command because of the Fat Leonard scandals and stuff. You know, how many naval accidents have they been recently with just things like basic seamanship and watch standing, you know, Navy destroyers crashing into merchant vessels and stuff. Like, there's a real sort of crisis of leadership in the Navy right now that we don't get to hear about that much. But when you're talking about nuclear weapons and you're talking about, you know, these interesting Hyman Rickover-esque sort of commander legacy in that service, is an interesting one. And finally, I think the third thing that is fascinating is the only reason that catastrophe doesn't happen in this movie is because of the very real protocol of the two-man rule in the Navy. A second man has to validate and authorize whether or not an order is a valid one. And I think that it sets up a really interesting argument as we're starting to have these conversations about the ethics of nuclear use. How do we, in like what Will's been talking about this whole time, in the heat of battle or in the heat of January 6th, like fall of the Republic sort of situation, you know, how can we validate that an order made under stress is the right one? Mm-hmm. And it gets into this question of, should the United States continue to maintain the ability to launch nuclear weapons first, you know, or should these be a deterrent only weapon, and the only time that we will use them is if somebody attacks us with one, you know? And the only way to be sure that weird human mistakes don't get in the way is to make sure that the scenario isn't available in the first place, right? And I think that this movie does a really interesting job of demonstrating that. Will's right. I give it a 9 out of 10. It's a great film. I think the legacy of you know, that there's 100 nuclear warheads on one of these submarines and there's 9 of them out there at all times. That is why there always has been a two-man rule.
Well, I think the movie portrays the process pretty well for submarines. I think not only is there a two-person authentication, you know, was this is valid, and the valid is the question, right? Is the order authenticated, and is that all it takes to be valid? Then Ramsey was correct in the situation. But if it's valid as a sense of, well, there was this other partial EAM and all this stuff, then that becomes what can make the previous order not valid anymore. But I think the movie is smart because, well, they have this philosophical debate about whether or not using nuclear weapons is good or bad, and I don't think Hunter would ever, if he felt the order was correct, in the sense of if that second EAM never came through, he would be completely fine with following through the process of authenticating and giving his approval to do that launch. It's not like this is a movie of a hippie who is saying, I don't want to launch nuclear weapons regardless of the order. I'm now having second thoughts, cold feet, any of those things. It's not that. It's a debate about that process piece. But in our field, we realize that it's not simply a matter of when you make the decision to use nuclear weapons or to build them, but the process, if the process is flawed or incorrect, it forces us to become like machines, like a doomsday machine on our own, following through a process that we know is going to result in a situation that's bad and not the most ideal one, or it breaks down and there's accidents and miscommunication and all of these things could happen and you end up in a situation that you didn't plan on being in anyway. So the process matters, the people matter, the decision matters, and that's why some people have concluded maybe just get rid of the nuclear weapons in the first place because none of our systems are really working all that well. There are things, if I wanted to, we could nitpick more on, like the idea of having to wait 60 minutes to fuel a missile hasn't been a problem for decades and decades. In the 90s, there were there are definitely liquid-fueled Russian missiles, but they don't take that long. This movie was probably showing an SS-18 or an SS-19. Those have liquid fuel, but the way that they're set up in the 90s, the SS-18, to fuel it takes about 1 minute. The SS-19 takes 25 minutes. These things, there are reasons why the fuel is stored separately, because it's corrosive and damaging, but they've gotten to the point where they can fuel these missiles with fast fuel pumps or this kind of weird mix of keeping some of the fuel in it and out. They can do it so quickly. So it's not this 60-minute problem is a problem of way earlier in the Cold War. I mean, the Russians, even with their new generation of ICBMs that they're building, RS-28 Sarmat, like that's still going to be using liquid fuel. You can just make an assumption. These days, if you had a missile that took 60 minutes to fire, that's a really bad situation to be in when it takes 30 minutes for the U.S. missiles to land on your target. So this is a situation. It's the same thing with what happened. I see Geoff has a poster of Dr. Strangelove behind him in his office. It's the same thing in that movie. You know, they kind of ignored the existence of missiles so that there would be time, and time allows a plot to happen, you know, in a movie. You can nitpick that, but I don't think it's worth getting into. I also could nitpick whether or not I think the Russians would actually attack the United States with a full-fledged nuclear strike, even if it was an accident of thinking, well, you know what, the Alabama thought that these missiles were being fueled, so they destroyed a single silo in Russia. Now, I don't know how close these silos were to Russian civilian sites, if the Russians would interpret this as a full-scale attack, even if it was only a limited strike here. This is the stuff that people debate about. You know, will the Russians take a single strike? Will the United States assume if there was one Russian attack of a tactical missile, would the United States then respond fully with a full-scale strike if that one tactical... You know, these things happen, but I'm just not as convinced as the movie is. It's like an automatic thing. But maybe that's...
And the point is that we don't want to have to find out.
We don't want to find out, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think this is so cool because this debate, I mean, it's not cool, but this debate is happening at so many different places here and there. So, you know, we couldn't nitpick these things, but I think overall, this movie is pretty damn good.
My favorite nitpick is all of the unsecured firearms in the Missile Control Center.
Yep.
Yeah, they're just like, we're going to take all the guns and just start running around. It's like, so this is a great way to quote The Hunt for Red October. Things down here don't take too kindly to bullets.
Right? I mean, like at the very, I don't know if it was just because they were filming all of the scenes with Viggo Mortensen on the same day, which includes where they go through the weapons locker and stuff. But like in the very first missile drill where they call down to him and everything's fine on board the ship, there's just a shotgun propped up against the wall, and I was like, that's not cool, man. Somebody's getting written up for that. Like,
yeah, he's taking his weapons specialist position pretty seriously. He's like, I just always have a bandolier of bullets on. So we normally would do our parking lot movie discussion where we talk about some of the non-nuclear things in here, like the fact that Al Pacino and Brad Pitt were almost cast as the leads of this movie, and kind of we can compare it to Hunt for Red October and all of these other ones. But I think Will's got to sign out here, so we may have to have this conversation.
Oh, I totally want to take the Al Pacino and Brad Pitt thing. Would have been an absolute disaster if that happened.
Ooh.
I mean, Denzel Washington is one of the best dramatic actors in the world, and he like shone like a star in this. Like,
it's great.
Stone cold, steely. Like he manages to like show emotion without showing too much emotion, like seeming like a badass. Gene Hackman was just like on point, being able to portray somebody as crazy as Jack D. Ripper from Dr. Strangelove, but in a very believable, like you walked the line of seeming like an absolute lunatic, yet seeming perfectly sane and just going by the book. It was really only that one instance where Jeff was talking about, right? Where that scene where he's like, I don't care. I'm going to fire you and I'm going to get somebody else to take over and launch and authenticate this code. That was the breach of protocol. And then, yeah, like holding a gun up to the head of like this innocent petty officer. 2 breaches of protocol. And really, like, you know, that just segues into another thing that was so amazing about this movie. Every single war movie you have ever seen, good guys, bad guys, really easy to tell them apart, right? Who was the good guy here? Who was the bad guy here? The good guys and the bad guys were the same guys, right? And going to like the very end of the movie, Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman, like they like salute each other, like, you know, kind of like walk off their own separate ways. They're buddies, they're pals. So well done. So anyways, and Brad Pitt had none of that. Like, hell no. Oh.
Well, there goes my chance of having Brad Pitt on the podcast at some point. Fair enough.
Blame it on me. It's okay.
Let's wrap up here. Let's do our rating system, where we usually rate the movie out of 5, with 1 being a terrible movie you'd never recommend to anybody, 5 being terrific. But I like to tailor the rating system. If I'm going to get super critical about the plot, I might as well get super critical about the rating system itself. So I've crunched the numbers here. I've talked to the dog in the movie, and because he's such a brilliant mind, and figured out, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to rate Crimson Tide on the scale of 1 out of 5 nuclear launch triggers on your submarine. Because if you've got just 1, Viggo Mortensen might hide it from you, and you won't be able to do what you want to do. But if you've got 5 triggers hidden all around your boat, not even Aragorn will be able to keep you from going ballistic. So I rate this movie a solid 4. I think I enjoy this movie a lot more than I think I did when I first saw it. It's great. It's a definite recommendation for people to see. I think some of the plotting stuff about kind of the nitpicks and things keep it from being a 4.5 or a 5, but I would surely love it if I might actually rewatch this movie again this week, but not with the mind of wanting to watch it for a podcast, just to enjoy it again, because sometimes I don't get to do that when I'm getting ready for a podcast. I'm thinking about things to talk about. I enjoy it, and I would love to watch it again. Will, what would you think about this one?
Straight up 5, because not the best movie in the world, right? It's not in my top 3 favorite movies.
There's a lot of talk about horses, both from a graphic standpoint and the history of horse racing, that I just this. I don't get what's going on here, and this seems important. So that's another thing that knocks off a quarter point for me.
That's what's his face that came in to punch up the script.
I'm sure, yeah, and it's silly.
Yeah. But really, so maybe not my top 3, definitely in my top 10 favorite movies after rewatching it.
Wow.
That's very, very good. I would highly recommend it to people. But really, giving it a 5, I just can't justify giving it anything less, because I can't. There are things to get super critical about, but there were no problems. It was watertight.
Like a submarine should be.
Yeah, as the submarine should be, yes. But I feel like they missed out on the perfect opportunity to make a sequel to this movie. And it's a sequel of what actually happened in those 60 minutes, right? Of when they started to file, a separate movie of what was going on the ground, the crisis response that led to the unconditional surrender of this Radchenko. I think that would be super cool.
And then trying to recall the submarine, why is our EAM message not being received? And
yes,
I can see this. I like it. I like it a lot. Jeff, what about you? How many nuclear triggers would you give this one?
Listen, I'm gonna go 110% on the reactor here, and I'm gonna say that I give this 5 out of 5 nuclear triggers as well. I agree with everything Will said. It's not a perfect movie, but there's so much to love here. The things that we talked about, these themes, ethical versus valid nuclear launch commands, confusion during a time of war, and the stress on nuclear launch orders, and then, what are we actually talking about when we're talking about nuclear war? I also think there's just a ton of other interesting stuff going on in this film. It's interesting looking at Crimson Tide from a 2021 perspective. There's probably a really interesting race relations in the Navy thing going on here. I think that having Denzel play the XO, and the Navy is traditionally been egalitarian, but having this older white crazy captain and the younger African-American XO and the other African-American sailors on the ship. There's a lot going on there that I haven't even had time to think about, but this is before Independence Day, which I think had Will Smith as the pioneering, African-American Marine hero kind of thing, and there's just a lot of interesting stuff to break down. And I really, really appreciate this film and sort of the discussions it got into.
If people like the rating about how enthusiastic you all are for this, they might be interested in thinking and reading and watching other things similar to this film. So let's do our recommendations here before we wrap up. I've got just 2 quick things here. One is The Man Who Saved the World. It's a documentary from 2013 about the story that Jeff discussed earlier about the Soviet submarine crews and the debates that they had that really was notably an inspiration for this film. Watch that. It's a great documentary. Occasionally pops up on Netflix as well. Second thing is an article. It's a little wonky, but it's a great resource. It's by Jeffrey Lewis and Bruno Tertrais. It's a CNS paper from our colleagues and friends at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies from 2019. It's called The Finger on the Button, The Authority to Use Nuclear Weapons in Nuclear Armed States. it's just a great and fairly recent resource on all of the different countries that have nuclear weapons and what we know about their launch authority. It's a lot more detailed on the missiles and bombers than it is on submarines, because as much as we know about them in the movie, a lot of this stuff still is fairly secret, and we know a lot more about the missile silos, I think, because of people like the late Bruce Blair, who was a former missileer, who really discussed quite a bit about the things and the process that he knew about when he was, commanding and working in missile silos. I think we haven't had a similar thing yet with a good resource for this stuff here. Geoff, what do you recommend to people?
Sure, a couple of things. One is to read the phenomenal book Blind Man's Bluff, which is about sort of the intelligence war between submarines during the Cold War. It's primarily with attack submarines, again, nuclear powered, not nuclear armed, although they could have been nuclear armed at the time, I guess. Talking about using submarines to tap into Russian communications lines on the bottom of the ocean. It also describes a number of submarine related incidents between US and Soviet submarines that bumped into each other while doing crazy Ivans and stuff, a whole bunch of really haired breadth thing that we almost came to crazy submarine war. Another one, there's many books and a documentary about this, but is Project Azorian, is a fascinating thing. It's about one of the many Russian nuclear submarines that have gone down, and the CIA realized that it was in shallow enough water that they could go recover it. So they built a mobile oil rig that actually was a cover for a giant hook and crane that lifted a Russian nuclear submarine off the bottom of the ocean, and in the process dropped 2 nuclear missiles to the bottom of the seafloor somewhere. Another great one. And then 2 that are on the top of my list that I haven't read yet but look interesting and I'm going to be checking out is 2034, Admiral Stavridis's new book about a potential Pacific escalating crisis with the Chinese that eventually goes nuclear. And then A Time to Die, which is about the Kursk incident back in early 2000s with the sinking of the submarine Kursk. So yeah, definitely all things worth checking out.
I could have sworn when you said 2034 that was the sequel to Metro 2033. And that's what you were talking about here, alluding to. It's more our Tomb story here. But this book sounds very also interesting as well. Will, what do you have to recommend to people?
Yeah, so the one that really stood out to me is this website. It's a project called the Armageddon Letters. This came out when I was in grad school. And it was timed with the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it is this interactive website that is just a huge collection of resources that are put together in a really cool interactive way, explaining what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it tells that story of the Soviet submarine B-59 and what went on there.
Geoff, Will, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast here. Let's do some quick plugs. Geoff, where can people find you other than your awesome, work on the Nukes of Hazzard podcast and other work that you do? Where can people find some of the things that you're talking and writing about these days?
Yeah, definitely check us out, the Nukes of Hazzard podcast. We're on Twitter at nukes_of_hazard. Also, myself at Nuclear Wilson on Twitter. Check out the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation and Council for a Livable World, where we get into the politics of nuclear weapons and talking with candidates and members of Congress and stuff. All some very interesting things for people to take a look at.
Great. Thanks, Geoff. Will, what about you? I know you're out in Norway these days. Where can people find you on social media if they can't make it all the way out there?
Yeah, I'm still very active on Twitter at Will Saetren.
That's a good spot. Thanks to everybody for being on the podcast here.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Supercritical Podcast. If you have any suggestions for future episodes or you want to tell us what we got wrong, either nukes-wise or maybe, we were joking about that dog knowing everything. Maybe you actually do know that dogs have a sixth sense, and I'm sorry I mocked you and your beliefs. A couple ways you can contact the show. On Twitter, I'm at Nuclear Podcast. We also have a website, supercriticalpodcast.com, where we put up all of our show notes, or at least the links to resources that we use to build the show notes. And I do check a Gmail account, supercriticalpodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, this has been Tim Westmyer,
Will Saetren,
and Geoff Wilson.
And remember, if it's pop culture and radioactive, we're bound to get super critical about it. Have a good one. And as well, I'll put a single ping just for you, Geoff, right at the end.
Hell yeah.
I like it. One ping only.